John, welcome to the show, and thank you for coming all the way from Cincinnati to Fort Worth, Texas. It means a lot.
Yep, happy to. Thanks for having me, Chris.
Yep, I hope you have a good time while you're here.
I'm sure.
Let's get started with a little bit about your background, kind of growing up, and what led you to kind of the current company that you run today.
Yeah, so I'm originally from near Albany, New York,
Okay.
Amsterdam, city of maybe 10,000 people. Went to undergrad there, Binghamton University, and then went to grad school in Cincinnati for MBA, so engineering MBA. And the MBA program brought me to Cincinnati to begin with.
Okay.
Otherwise, probably like most people, didn't know anything about it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was just bumming around Cincinnati, graduated. I worked for a very small software company for 2 years as a project manager, and kind of got interested in real estate on the side. And I think it always been kind of in my heart and mind, but Cincinnati was like, a good place to start it.
Yeah.
So yeah, just as like a side project, we found this shell of a building, 3 stories, 2,000 square feet, and we bought for $5,000.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And, totally bombed out, like no windows, no roof, pretty major masonry work required and stuff. But it seemed small enough and cool enough that I was interested and kind of just started that way on the side. And so a year into that, basically quit my job like a fool and jumped in full time with my company Kunst that I've been running since 2015.
It's Kunst.
Yeah, Kunst, yes.
What's that mean?
It's a German word. I saw one of the questions on Twitter was, why'd you name it that? It's close to a word we can't say on radio.
Yeah.
But so Kunst is a German word, the German word for art. The neighborhood that we primarily develop in is over the Rhine. So there's German roots there. A lot of my history is German. So
Cool.
It seemed like a nice tie and also a nice short domain name.
I love it. You are the first person to ever be on this podcast that bought a building for $1 per square foot. What did you say? It was
maybe $2.
Yeah, $2 a square foot.
Yeah.
Before we even get into that, what was that project? Because clearly it was successful and it made you want to do more. But what was the project? What was the goal, and how did it work out?
Yeah, so I think I came into it. I heard Mark Laurie maybe say like missionary and mercenary.
Yeah,
and I think I came into a lot more missionary.
Mm-hmm.
I just saw this cool building. I liked history, architecture, cities, whatever, and that was my primary motive in this building. And then also that it was possible. It was $5,000. Like I think I can do that.
Yeah. Can you even finance it for $5,000, or you just pay all cash?
Yeah, I think purchase is all cash.
Yeah.
Actually, most of ours the purchase is just cash because they're relatively not that expensive to buy, and most of the cost is construction.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's kind of how it got started. And
what did you do with that project? You fixed it up.
Yeah, so it was
out.
totally vacant, hadn't been lived in probably for 40 years. But good bones, beautiful historic building, the original cornice and plaster and all this stuff, the original floors, which we kept. So yeah, we totally renovated it. We used historic tax credits, which I know we'll talk about. That was the first one. Someone just told me it was interesting, these tax credits, and a consultant maybe foolishly sent me an example of them. I said, it's just like a 20-page PDF. I can do that. And so so kind of, stumbled through that first one and figured it out. But yeah, so it's 3 apartments. Total renovation was like $150,000.
Okay.
And we rented it out for 3 years and then sold it and, did pretty well.
So give me a little background on just what you do at Kunst. Like, what are y'all focused on?
Yeah, so I started the company in 2015.
Okay.
We do historic renovations in urban Cincinnati. So it's really just downtown in this over the Rhine neighborhood. We completely renovate, all new everything, new roof, HVAC, plumbing, a total kind of gut renovation. There's pretty much nothing there anyways.
Yep.
And then we rent them out as apartments and using these historic tax credits. We've done the tax credits on every project. It's a key part of what we do. And we right now would not do a project without them. And yeah, we don't really have an intent of like how long we're going to hold or if we're forced to sell or even refinance. We're kind of, the tax credits provide a lot of liquidity and we're fine just to hold the buildings until it makes sense. And we've sold 1. We're working to sell 2 more. So we'll sell when it makes sense or we'll hold when it makes sense.
Cool. And everything is multifamily. Do you do any commercial?
It's all apartments.
Okay.
Some of them have first floor commercial. We just actually have our first floor commercial tenant.
Okay. I don't know a damn thing about Cincinnati. I know it's in Ohio. But can you give me a little bit of background just on the market, like how big it is, how many of these neighborhoods and projects there are to do? Like, how big's your market?
Yeah, so around late 1800s, it was one of the biggest cities in the country, maybe top five. It was the Chicago before Chicago became a thing. So it sort of has the infrastructure and the bones of a massive city.
Yeah.
Right? If you were downtown, you would think it could be Lower Manhattan or Chicago or something. So that's what it feels like, and I think that's what I'm drawn to. Like you can feel that the energy is there and the possibilities there.
Yeah.
In the bones, the historic bones in our case.
Yeah.
So yeah, the metro area I think is maybe 2 million. The urban area is like 300,000. The true like downtown is only like 15,000.
Okay.
Procter & Gamble's headquartered there. Macy's was, but they left. Kroger is headquartered there. Major research university, hospitals.
Okay.
And I think like a lot of cities, probably St. Louis, Pittsburgh, Louisville, the migration is probably a lot actually from the suburbs.
Okay.
Millennials, graduate or even the generation after are now graduating and don't want to live in the suburb they grew up in. Maybe they want to move downtown. And so that's kind of a lot of our migration is from the regional area and from the suburbs of Cincinnati.
Okay. And within that market, do you do deals in lots of different kind of submarkets, or are they all kind of in the same area?
All in the same area.
Okay.
We have, I think, 14 buildings now. The two furthest are probably 1.5 miles apart.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And is that because it's a great area, or that's the only place in town where you can do historic tax credit deals, or?
Yeah. So one of the requirements for the tax credits is that they're in a historic district. And so this over the Rhine and parts of downtown are all automatically in this historic district. And so that makes it pretty ripe. And there's a lot of vacant buildings because everyone left in the 50s and 60s. So it's kind of this perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
I got it. All right. Let's dive into historic tax credits.
Yeah.
I've heard about them forever and candidly know very little about them. So I'm going to ask the most elementary questions and then we'll try and get more detailed. But let's just start with, what is a historic tax credit?
Yeah. So it's a federal and now state program.
Okay.
That's trying to incentivize basically a high level of historic preservation.
Okay.
So the federal state government is going to give you a tax break on the renovation that you do of a building. So in the federal case, which is available in every state, it's 20% credit.
Okay.
On qualified costs. And the state level, it varies by state, but it's anywhere from maybe 15 to 30%. In Cincinnati or in Ohio, it's 25%. Same in Texas, actually. So combined, 45% of your project cost is going to come as a credit.
Okay.
So spend $1 million in qualifying costs, you have a $450,000 tax credit, which can be used against your personal taxes. If you have a $450,000 tax liability, I have this credit, you'd pay no tax.
Yep.
So that's the basic idea.
Okay. And okay, so you have these districts where historic tax credits can be used. You've identified a building, and you said that up to 45%. So you get it in the form of a credit.
Mm-hmm.
You can use it against your personal tax liabilities. When you have LPs, how do you distribute that credit amongst the LPs, or like how do they receive the benefit?
Yeah, so the state tax credit can be distributed however you want to owners in the LLC. So that can be to the LPs, GP, whoever. It can 99% can go to Wilmer, no matter how much he's invested in the project, as long as he's a owner. So it's really easy in Ohio, and that's the case not in every state, but in many of them. You can just choose how you want to distribute it, and you can distribute it to the LPs. The federal is a little more complicated. You can only use the credit up to the percentage you own in the LLC.
Okay.
So you can technically sell it. I could sell it to you. You become a de facto 99% owner of the LLC. And then you can use 99% of the credit. But it's, then you have to get lawyers and all this stuff.
How do y'all use the credits?
So the state credit is refundable in Ohio. So it just comes as cash.
They just send you, so you finish the project. We'll get into how it works, but you finish the project, say, here's what we spent, and then they wire you cash.
Yeah, it's the same as a tax refund. I mean, the first time I got it, it was like, the first one was very small, $40,000, like literally direct deposit. I was like, oh,
that's nice. Yeah,
this is interesting.
Thank you, government.
Yeah, so it's rare that the government money flow works that way, but in the state of Ohio, it does. So that one's quite good. And then, but the federal credit, it's not refundable, and so using that against liability, we, at the beginning, I didn't know enough about it, and now we're working more either making sure that LPs can use it. and then it's part of their returns, or we're selling it to someone that can use it.
And if you were to sell it to someone who could use it, you would just take the cash and then distribute that to LPs.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And then when the state sends it to you, you take the cash and I presume distribute that back to LPs.
Yeah. And mostly, the LPs are going to have the early kind of cash flow until we get into a promote or whatever.
Yeah.
So yeah, the state credit is normally paying back, say 70 or 80% of the initial capital.
And does the credit come, does the cash come once the project's completed, or do you get it along the way?
Only if you're using the credit, getting it from the government, only when the project is done.
Okay.
Potentially, if you sell it, you can get that cash earlier.
Okay. All right. So you've found a deal in a historic tax credit district. You want to do the deal. How do you begin the process of getting a tax credit?
Yeah. So it's an application. You typically will do the state and federal at the same time. There's a lot of the application which overlaps. And so you just kind of do them together.
Okay.
The federal credit is much more interested in what you're doing in the interior of the building.
Okay.
So the incentive is really like a much higher level of preservation. It's not just renovate an old building. It's what are you going to do with that door? What are you going to do with this window? All this stuff. So you have like a 20-page PDF, which is this is the current conditions. It has the original windows, has the original doors, this plaster molding you can see in this photo. And then you're going to say what you're going to do. We're going to keep that plaster molding. Oh, we're going to put new windows in, etc. And that's the federal piece. You're basically applying to say, we are going to do this high-level historic preservation, and these are the details of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes through this kind of continual review process where their motive is like maximum preservation, and your motive is like, okay, let's be reasonable.
Yeah.
And then the state credit includes that, so you have to get through that part. But then it's much more financially motivated. So, do you have the funds to complete the project? What's the timeline? What's the poverty in the area? How many jobs are you creating? All that stuff. And that's scored out of 100.
Okay.
And in Ohio, it's competitive. And so only the top scores win. So if you just came in and say, hey, no, I don't really have the money and I'm not hiring anyone to do this, I'm just handyman Joe, whatever, like you're probably not going to win.
Yeah.
But, if it's a really strong financial project, then you get the credit. And that's what the state of Ohio cares about. They're trying to like generate, jobs and income.
And how many times a year does Ohio approve credits? Is it like a lottery system that you submit and once a year you get approved, or are they doing it every month? Or?
You apply twice a year. So now it's basically like February and August.
Okay.
And so you find out about the credits like June and December.
Okay.
And that's the only 2 windows you can apply.
So before going for the application, when you've identified a property, what's all the work that you've done before you go to application? Obviously, you've already identified what you're going to save and who you're going to hire, but what's all the upfront work you need to get done before you even go apply?
Yeah. So assuming we've bought the building, before we'd even buy it, like we'd make sure it qualifies for the credits.
Right.
It's in a historic district. It's old enough and whatever.
Yeah.
So assuming all that, once we're about to apply, in the best case, we have full architectural plans. Everything is well documented, full photos and stuff. And you go into the application with that. It's just much easier.
Yeah.
Rather than like, hey, here's a 70% plan. And they'll sort of conditionally approve that. Then you say, oh, wait, actually, we changed it. And you have to like run in these circles. And we figured that out over time of like, if you can just start with, this is our exact plan and you give feedback based on that, it's a lot easier.
And so if they give you feedback along the way, you're missing a few things, you can go back, revise it. If you go back and revise it and then bring it back to them.
Yeah. And they are very good with that. They want you to get the credit. They're trying to incentivize this development.
Yeah.
And so you apply in February and until June, it's pretty much constant revisions, maybe 3 or 4 going back and forth. Well, they'll say like, hey, you said you're going to, get rid of this door, but we require that you keep it.
Yeah.
Stuff like that.
Okay. Well, you've done 14 of them. I would imagine the first like 1 or 2 was probably a lot of back and forth, a lot of work. Now you're on 14. It's probably a lot simpler. What are the things that you did wrong on like the first 2? You're not wrong, but took a lot more time that you just don't do now. It's just obvious how to do it.
Yeah, I think one thing early on is I tried to be a little sneakier of like, if I just provide 5 photos, they won't have much to give feedback on.
Yeah.
And which sounds good. But then they're like, okay, we need 80 more photos because we clearly can't see all these parts of the building. And so then you have to go back, take the photos and do the whole thing again. So that's one. I think it's just, more information is probably better. The plainer that you can make it is the better. Often cases people that are kind of historic preservationists. They might not necessarily be architects or even developers. And so, really deep architectural details is going to get lost. And so, the simpler that you can make it, the better. I think those are the two main ones. And then, just being well set up at the beginning because, if you're revising at the same time they're reviewing, it's just a nightmare.
Do you have to own the property before you can even submit an application, or can you have it under contract?
You have to own it or be allowed by the owner to apply by the time they're awarded.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is it federal that's nitpicking the plans, or is it state?
Only federal.
Okay. And they're out of Washington, I assume?
Yeah, sorry. That's all for the federal application, but it's a state, it's first the state group that's reviewing it. So in our case, they're in Columbus. It's the State Historic Preservation Office, SHIPO. So they're reviewing all those details, and then they pass it off to Washington. It's the National Park Service.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like along that way, you mentioned a lot of pictures. Do they actually physically come to the property?
So they have the right at any point, including up to 5 years after the project, to come visit the property. They typically don't, because I imagine that would be impossible.
Yeah.
We've had, we've done 35 projects, including 20 basically as consultants or partnerships, 14 of our own.
Right.
They've probably come 3 times. So it's pretty rare, but they can.
They can.
Yeah.
And like when you're done with the project, does even somebody from the state at least show up to see that it's all done, and you just send them pictures of a done building?
Yeah, it's mostly done by photos.
Okay. In these buildings, you mentioned saving like doors and crown molding and windows. Do you have to save everything, or do you have to save a percentage of everything?
Yeah. So I think one misconception, which we've heard a few times lately, is like there has to be a lot of historic character left in order to qualify for the tax credits.
Right.
But that's actually not the case. Like there's no prerequisite of like historic character.
Yeah.
It's that the building is old enough in a historic district, and it hasn't been like totally butchered. If it was a 1910 building, but it has like a huge addition on the front, you can't even tell.
Yeah.
And maybe, but otherwise, like if there's nothing left in the interior, you're fine.
Yeah.
And the sneaky thing is it's actually probably better because you have to save less.
Right.
Not necessarily what I'm interested in, maybe, but it's actually probably better. So, but their typical rule of what to preserve is if it's there, you pretty much have to keep it.
Okay.
If it's not there, they're not going to make you rebuild it or imagine what was there or replicate. It just kind of has to be compatible.
I'm not trying to skirt the rules. I'm not a rule skirter. But I would imagine if I bought a building and there was something like a door that can you not just go into the property and remove everything you want to remove before you start sending pictures?
Yeah,
how do they hold you accountable to that?
You technically cannot do any construction until it's approved.
Okay. That's it.
That's
the answer. Yeah. And is most of what you're buying, like it hasn't been touched for decades or years, or do you buy stuff that somebody had lived in a year before?
It varies. I'd say the average like vacancy by the time we buy is probably 25 years.
Yeah.
So normally people have been long gone, or they were living there like, probably illegally and in very weird conditions in 2008 or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, the condition we come across is it could be totally bombed out. There's literally like joists and brick walls.
Yeah.
And then some are like a time capsule. They haven't been touched in 70 years, and it's all the original doors, original floors, trim, crown molding, all this stuff.
Do you have a preference?
It's easier. I think what I was alluding to is like if it's bombed out, you can kind of do whatever you want in the interior, but even including like layout, with floor plan layout. They very much care about that. So like financially and ease, it's better if there's nothing there. But emotionally, I like the historic character. And
if you have something that's totally bombed out, though, do they want you to renovate it to where the finished product still looks very historical, or in that situation you could do something more modern?
Yeah, their term is just compatible, and so probably a 4-panel door because that was true to the era. A taller, maybe like 6-inch trim because that was maybe more the profile of the era. Hardwood floors, like stuff like that. So it's kind of compatible with the era, but yeah, it doesn't have to like match exactly what was there because no one knows, and it can't be like super crazy modern.
I don't want to ask like the dumbest question. This might be the dumbest question of the day, but why do states and federal governments care so much about these historical buildings and keeping them historical as opposed to just demolishing them and doing something new?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. So the tax credit program itself came out of the 60s and 70s, and I think in that point we had realized, for the previous 40 years we're just demolishing everything.
Yeah,
and it was all in sort of northeast cities and throughout the country, like highways, malls. Let's just get rid of everything and make it all new. And I think in 60s and 70s we kind of went against that. I was like, actually,
kind of nice to
yeah, some buildings certainly, not all of them, but some should be saved, and we should incentivize this. So I think that's really the intent, is to preserve the character and not to do it in maybe a super regulatory way, which is good. It's more of an incentive-based way. Like, hey, if you want to do all this extra pain, we would prefer it was, historically renovated, and so we'll incentivize that.
Yeah.
And kind of keeps the character of the neighborhood. I mean, for example, in Over the Rhine, like it's all National Historic District,
right?
Low scale. And so they're trying to incentivize basically keeping that character.
Is there a point where the building is so deteriorated that you actually can knock it down? Or is there a point where it's just in a condition where you don't have to preserve what's there?
Yeah. So, in a historic district, you don't have to go for the credits. You can kind of do whatever you want on the interior, and then or even the exterior, then you're guided by the local guidelines.
Right.
In our case, there's a historic conservation board. They're going to restrict much more demolition or the exterior of the building.
Mm-hmm.
But once you go for this incentive, then there's no scenario where they would allow demolition or, basically non-historic work.
And if there's raw land in a historical district, again, this might be the answer you just gave me. Would you still have to build something that looks historic if you did ground up development on vacant land, or you can do whatever you want, or it goes in front of the board and they're probably going to make you stick to?
Yeah. So new construction in a historic district, it does not qualify for the tax credits, but it is bound by the local guidelines, the Historic Conservation Board. And they're going to have kind of jurisdiction over what you build there.
And is the target demographic of who rents this stuff, is it trying to provide more affordable housing, or is it trying to provide housing to people that want to live in something historic, or a mix of both?
Yeah, it's market rate. I think probably, the millennial and younger generation is maybe more interested in sort of maybe historic preservation and, I don't know, unique kind of interior character, well built, hopefully. So I think that's really our target. It does end up being affordable just because we aim for like hyper dense, very small units, and it's kind of well laid out in these, tenement buildings where they were just packing people in.
Yeah.
So sometimes we're just kind of guided by that, and so we're going for the maximum density. I think financially, and also just because that's what the buildings allow for.
Yeah.
And as a result, it's affordable. You might have a 2-bedroom that's 500 or 600 square feet, and so it's only like $1,000.
Do you have challenges finding like subs that can work on this type of work, or can most everybody do what you need them to do?
Yeah, I think 80% of the subs are overlap with any construction. I think like the plumber, the electrician. For us, everything is brand new. They're not trying to hook onto the knob and tube wiring. We're just all new, so it's basically new construction. But then there's the remaining 20%, which is pretty specialized.
Yeah.
Maybe custom windows, custom doors, stuff like that. And so I come from much more the construction side. I worked at a construction company for a year, basically as a laborer to learn the game.
Yeah.
And we're the general contractor, and so we can guide that a lot more of like finding subs, or I know that this guy can do finished carpentry. He's really good. I can guide him towards doing this custom molding that we need, and it'll be a lot less expensive than like some shop or some national shop or something.
So when they're doing let's take doors and windows, are they usually taking the windows off the building, taking them to some other location, refinishing them all, and then bringing them back, or is it happening on site?
Yeah, it used to happen a lot more on site, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend that
because of theft. Or
no, we have been robbed a lot actually, but no, the windows on site. It's just it's not a shop that's set up.
Yeah.
So it's better to find a place or a sub that can take them off site and return them in a month. Yeah, and one thing too is like the historic tax credits are not trying to preserve necessarily everything from like the old time period, like all new electric, HVAC, wall units, all that stuff.
Yep.
And also in most cases, like it can be new windows. If there's nothing there, they don't want you to do like a wood rope and pulley. Like you can put in a Pella window, but it just has to be like the right profile.
Is there, so it's really the aesthetics that they're most worried about. The guts of the place is all new. Can we just go through the list again of what are the typical things that need to stay and need to be preserved? We have windows, we have doors. What else?
They really care about windows. They care about doors. They care about anything that's there and they see in a photo.
Okay.
Which could be like decorative plaster. The original floors, though, they often want you to keep, but they can be flexible there.
Okay.
You know, put a new hardwood floor down. They do like, they call it like the circulation, where, you know, like how people are moving through hallways, where are the units, where are the doors located, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
They want you to preserve that. A lot of the trim, like finished carpentry, base trim, door trim, all that kind of stuff.
What about the hardware?
Hardware, they don't care that much. You do typically have to specify, but they're not that picky.
Yeah.
Paint colors, you also specify. I think they're just trying to avoid like neon green, but otherwise not super particular.
Yeah.
They want to make sure anything you're adding, which could be like a rooftop deck or cutout, like condenser units on the roof, anything like that, is not super visible.
Okay.
You're not going to add like just 2-story baller deck on the top of your historic building.
Yeah.
You know, and like everyone from the street is now like impacted by that.
Yeah.
Might be sweet, but they don't like it. So they care a lot about that. They do care about like drop ceilings, things like that. If you're impacting the space, especially if you can see it from the exterior.
It's like if you took hardwood floors that were in there, and maybe this is just more your personal preference, are you always electing to resand them and refinish them and keep them? Or are you trying to put new floors in?
We've done both. I think if the floor is pristine, you know, like all the wood is mostly there.
Yeah.
It can be easy, cost effective, and also I think like look very nice to have that original hardwood floor. I mean, it's 140-year-old like solid timber.
Yeah.
Which, you know, would cost a lot of money now, and you can just, it's already there.
Yeah.
So we've gone that way, but then also over time, it's like, well, sound and just ease of install and finding subs that can do it and all this stuff. Like, well, let's just do it new. It'll be hardwood. Like I would never do, like I would always do a hardwood. I would never do probably less than that.
Yeah.
Just in these, you know, in this case. But yeah, we do 50-50 and just, it depends on the condition of the floors. Or
I remember I used to flip homes, and it was always exciting when you'd go into one and pull up the carpet and see not like the old hardwood floors underneath.
Yeah.
Like a surprise.
Yep. Oh, I have a resounding cry of like, it's amazing how much money people spend to make things worse.
I know.
And yeah, you just see like ductwork, like this beautiful, you know, transom window into a hallway of this historic building. And then there's just a duct like blasted right through the middle of it. And you're like, drop ceilings. You're like, why?
Yeah.
Like you spend so much energy on this. Like, why?
The irony of it is the like you said, the quality of the products and like the design and character from back in the day. And now we live in a world where I would argue the products are much cheaper.
Yeah.
They don't look near as good.
For sure.
People knew how to build back then.
For sure. Yeah. And it's all solid masonry. I mean, it's some of these have literally not had a roof for 40 years and they're just kind of hanging out like, all right.
Yeah.
You know, but it's like solid timber joists and hardwood floors. All the woods are solid wood and, you know, like ivory handles, like crazy stuff that would be super expensive now. Like it's already there.
Yeah.
You know, you can just preserve it.
And the historic boards are, we have never done a project here, but I know of the historic board here in town. They are intense.
Yeah.
I mean, they mean
the hysterical society.
They are the hysterical society. I would assume that's kind of the case everywhere. If you're on the historical board, you want to keep things historical.
Yeah. And so again, there's kind of the two bodies maybe we're interacting with. There's like the Cincinnati Historic Conservation Board, which actually in Cincinnati is quite good. It has to be made up of like at least one developer, at least one like financial person, one historian, one architect. And so it actually ends up being pretty balanced.
Yeah.
And their motive is historic preservation, but they can be very fair. And it's led by a really awesome woman, Beth Johnson. Shout out, Beth.
Hey, thanks,
great.
Beth.
Yeah, she's like a great civic person. So anyway, so that's the local level, and they're actually fairly reasonable, I think. And then there's the state review board that we're going in front of for the tax credits, and they're a little less reasonable, but you know their motive is historic preservation. Yeah. So they can be very fair when they want to be.
Can you start construction during the application process, or you cannot start until you've been granted the credit?
Yeah, technically you can't start any construction. I mean, you can clean out. Of course, you can submit for permits and get financing and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But you technically can't swing a hammer until they've approved it.
Okay, so day comes, you're approved with your credit. What do you get? A document or a promise for something in the future?
Yeah. Basically certificate of the award. For the Ohio case, it'll show an actual dollar amount, $200,000 up to $200,000, depending on how much you spend, for example. And that's just a certificate. Typically, you're committing to finish the project within 2 years.
Okay.
And so you just start from there. And you can, they provide extensions, but yeah, you're kind of off to the races to get it done.
If a project goes over budget, do they increase the size of the tax credit, or they set the dollar amount the day you're approved?
The state credit is capped because they, every cycle, they only have a certain amount of money to give away.
Yep.
So you apply for a number and that's your max number. It could be less, but it can't be more. The federal credit is truly 20% of what you spend. So that's, to some degree, unlimited.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So getting back to the state credit, that is cash that comes in.
Yeah.
And remind me again, in your business plan, what do you typically do when that cash comes in?
So that's getting returned to the LPs in almost every case. The rough numbers is it's 70 or 80% of the equity is kind of returned right back. You have to finish the project and all that stuff. But yeah, a lot of the equity comes out just from the state tax credit.
And does any of this have to do with property tax values? It's the word tax. So that has nothing to do with what you're going to be charged on a property tax basis.
Totally separate.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the federal credit, you said comes in, but you can't, it doesn't come in as cash. It's a true credit.
Yes.
And so historically, what have y'all done with your federal credits?
So at the beginning, the first probably 2 or 3 projects, we were just very motivated around the state credit, and the federal credit was like, I don't know what to do with this. Even now, not a tax person, I'm like, I can't use it. Anyone? Ask some people maybe. So it wasn't hyper utilized, but now my strong preference is that we just sell it, because to try to figure out the tax implications for all the investors and figure out what that means for the returns and all that kind of stuff, it's like, I'd rather just sell it to somebody who knows they can use it, understands the program, is set up to do it. Just sell it and get that cash. That is then, probably going to get returned to the LPs as well.
And could I, Chris Powers, buy your federal tax credit, even though I'm down in Texas and have nothing to do with the project?
Yeah. So, non-CPA, whatever, disclaimer, but you can use the federal credit against passive income, or if you are a real estate professional. So you can probably, I would say you can definitely use the federal tax credit.
So if I was in a different industry, I couldn't buy it.
Yeah, you can use it. Yeah, passive income, or if you're a real estate professional.
Do you have any idea how those credits are valued when you go to sell them?
Yeah, so we've sold a couple, and we're looking to sell more. It really depends on, they're going to price in some risk. So the size of the credit, how early are they buying it? How much, when are they actually buying it? And when are they paying in? That all factors in, but it's somewhere maybe from the lowest I've seen is like maybe 60 cents. And then the largest or the best is probably like 90 cents.
Okay. Go a little deeper on like when they're paying in, and do the credits have a limit on them?
Yeah. So we have a $200,000 federal tax credit. You might buy it for $160,000, and we have some lengthy agreement. We'll pay lawyers a lot of money for to determine like what are the terms of that.
Yeah, and
that might include like 25% of it you're going to pay day one. Like, we just got this federal credit. You're buying it today. You might pay 25% of that $160,000 in day one.
Okay,
25% might be once you are hanging drywall. 25% might be like when you're putting up cabinets, and then 25% like a month after occupancy, whatever. Like, we just set those terms because you're basically just buying this credit. We want the money, but you and I can set the terms of like when you're paying in and everything.
Wait, so real quick. So what you're saying is I would have to have a project also going on that I'm buying your credit to?
No, we have the federal credit, which we're selling to you.
But you get that at the end of the project, right?
Yeah. But you like, depending how we structure it, you can pay in that money earlier. And depending what I need, if I say I need the money to close on the building, maybe, or like I just want liquidity over this year of construction.
Yep.
I'll sell the credit to you for 70 cents on the dollar if you'll give me half of that today.
And so my risk, if I start buying it early, is that you don't finish the project.
Yeah.
So that's why I'd buy it kind of in increments as you get
exactly
along.
Yeah. And you definitely, as the investor, wouldn't want to have all the money in before, occupancy and the credit actually comes.
Yeah.
That's your risk.
Do you ever sell them like without selling them in stages? You just sell it at the very end once you have the whole thing?
Yeah, if we don't need the money, which typically we're not trying to sell the federal credit necessarily for the project.
Right.
So we kind of sell it at the end, and maybe there's smaller payments along the way. What's nice now is there are banks that will include it. And so I think a potential dream scenario is you sell the state and federal credit up front, and you probably then only have to put in like 5% equity.
Yeah.
There's like, trade-offs there, but that is technically possible.
So in theory, if you had a $200,000 federal tax credit and I owed $200,000 in taxes,
yep,
I could buy that from you for $160,000.
Yep.
And so basically I have a $40,000 reduction in what I would have had to pay in taxes had I not bought your credit.
Yep, exactly. And the tax reform a couple of years ago weakened it a little bit. You now actually have to spread it over 5 years. That didn't used to be the case. So it's still the same thing, but you would technically have to spread that $200,000 benefit over 5 years.
Is there like an online marketplace where you can list your tax credits for sale, or do people just have to know who you are and be calling you?
Not that I know of that there's an actual marketplace. Once you get over $1 million in credits, there are a lot of like national, local banks, people that will buy it. You can like Google, tax credit syndicator or buyer Ohio, and there's, maybe 3 big ones. But the legal brain damage is so much that it has to be at least $1 million. And so that's something we've kind of struggled with and had to figure out, like, how do you sell a $80,000 credit? How do you sell a $200,000 credit?
Yeah. So the current limit is you have to be selling at least $1 million worth.
For the big players that care at all.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so to sell something smaller, it's more of who you know or somebody knows to call you.
Yeah, exactly. Or a bank that can wrap their mind around it, or an investor, honestly. I mean, if you had, a good relationship with an investor that could understand the credits, like that would be fantastic. Your uncle has the money, has a federal tax liability, buys it. Beautiful. But that's pretty rare.
I might need to buy some tax credits from you.
Yeah, I think, I haven't harped on this a ton on Twitter, but I just think like that's such, obviously I'm biased and there's risk in real estate, disclosures, but like, I think it's a fantastic way to make money is just to buy credits, especially if you understand real estate. Like, I know the risk is the project doesn't get done. As long as I'm sure that that's going to happen, I can make 40% in 2 years or whatever.
Yeah.
It can be pretty great.
If somebody's listening to this, somebody needs to create a marketplace for tax credits. That's insane to me.
Yeah.
Because I imagine how many small $200,000 there are.
Tons.
And the only market that you really have to sell it is who's in your network.
Yeah. In Ohio, there's probably 50 a year, small credits.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. And part of it too is like, the supposed brain damage of lawyers, it's just you're signing an agreement of like, I am nominally buying into 99%. This is how it vests. This is how it pays. Like it's not easy, but it's also not that complicated.
Right.
And so to each time to have to spend like $60,000 on legal costs, like doesn't make sense at all.
Yeah.
I imagine it's fairly templated, not a lawyer. But so anyways, yes, I agree with you. Like a marketplace where legal docs are pretty well set up, all that I think could be really powerful. And I imagine it plays in like low income housing and, new markets, and I don't know much about those, but it's probably similar.
Man, somebody needs to do this. If I didn't know you and was looking around the country for tax credits, is there a place that I go, like, is there a government Ohio website where I could go and like actually see all the tax credits that were granted that year and then just pick up the phone and call you that way?
Yeah. It's all, freedom of information. You can request even the entire application. If anybody wants to do that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the federal program, there's a website you can actually just search like by address or whatever. And the state is more like press release. They release all the projects. I don't know that there's an actual database that's public, but you can search for it and they always do a press release.
And so just to confirm, I buy your $200,000 tax credit and let's just say you gave me an extra good deal. I bought it for $140,000.
Yeah.
I'll use $40,000 a year for 5 years to get my full $200,000 benefit.
Yep, exactly.
I cannot use it the same year.
Yeah, you can use it in the year that we get a certificate of occupancy. And then it has to be, 20% a year for 5 years, up to 5 years, or, minimum of 5 years, up to 10.
Yeah. So and you said you have sold a few federals. I'm just assuming it's to some other individuals that know who you are and know what you're about. And
yeah, we found a good local bank that bought a current project of ours.
the banks will buy them.
Yeah, the banks, like small local banks. I mean, it's a really it's a hard pitch. Like you couldn't just pitch it to a bank probably cold and they'd be like, what is this tax credit? Why would I fund this? It's risky, blah, blah, blah. But we did find a bank and there are a few that will buy them. But yeah, the best case is that you just have somebody that you know that can buy them.
Okay. Somebody asked on Twitter, do you use credit value as equity?
You can, yeah. So that's what we did with the bank.
Okay.
Where we net probably put in like 12% equity, like true cash.
Yep.
And the rest was them buying our credits.
Yep. And so as the project went on, they would just keep paying you, and that was the equity you needed to get it done.
Yeah, or they're paying themselves, I guess.
Yeah. Well, is it the same bank that gave you the loan?
Yeah, I guess they're paying us, and we're putting into the building.
Got it.
Yeah.
Do the deals that you do, like, they wouldn't work without the tax credit?
I think the rough math is like we probably get to a high single digit IRR, no tax credits at all. The tax credits provide a lot of liquidity earlier, and hopefully the plan is we get into like high teens, low 20s with the tax credits.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. When you're submitting for the application, do you use a consultant at this point, or do you just do it on your own?
Yeah, I think, fortunately or unfortunately, I just bumbled through the first one, and then I knew more than most anyone else because I had done one, and so people hired us, and we do our own. So it's actually my partner in the business that does all the tax credits, so it's all in house. We're probably going to do less of like the documentation work, as we're growing. I think a lot of that can actually fall on the architect because they're the closest to the plans. So yeah, we'll do less of the documentation. We'll probably always do the sort of financial piece, but yeah, we've never really hired a consultant to do it.
And when it comes to architecture plans, do they have to be full CAD drawings, or can they be sketches and just rough?
So technically, they can be hand drawn.
Okay.
Yeah. You need to have plans and schematics. It's in the letter of the law is like you don't have to hire an architect, but it'll make your life a total pain. The worse the plans are. So yeah, they don't have to be, but it helps.
Okay, on the consultant thing, and again, this is off of Twitter, so I'm not even sure exactly what it means, but he said, do you use a consultant to prepare your part twos? What's a part two and a part one?
Yeah, so on the historic piece, there's 3 parts. The first part is this building qualifies. It's historic in a historic district. The part 2 is that documentation piece, so a 20-page PDF of like, we're keeping this door, we're doing this with the windows, etc. That's the part 2. And then the part 3 is when you're done, you certify that you did what you promised in the part 2. So no, but we've never hired someone to do the part 2.
So part 1 is you can literally just go online and verify that it's a historic building in a historic district.
Yeah, that's like a 1-page thing and say it's old building, historic district. That's pretty much it.
And then part 3, where you're sending them the final product, is that again just taking lots of pictures, showing them your CO or something? What goes into the part 3?
Yep. CO, the photos, and those are all to a photo key. They're going to match that up with your part 2 of like, hey, in photo 3, at the beginning of the project, I saw this door, but now photo 3 at the end of the project, I don't see that door, and you committed in the part 2 to keep it. Like, what happened? So anyways, so the part 3 is certifying you did what you said you were going to do.
Okay. All right. A few of these questions are from Twitter. So, how do you structure your exits with the tax credit investor LPs after the compliance period? Have we already covered that?
Yeah. So when the project is done, the tax credits come, and the state comes as cash, federal. I think we've covered it. There is, for 5 years after that, you're technically subject to recapture, where if you then replace all the windows with vinyl 2 years into the 2 years after occupancy, they could take away the remaining 3 years of the credit, if that makes sense.
Yep.
So they maybe they're talking about that, but by then we already have the money and we're not going to screw it up, hopefully.
And it doesn't, do you have to hold it for a certain amount of time after you've done, or can you just go right to market and sell it if you wanted?
It's similar. If you sell the building, it's subject to recapture. So you could lose the final years of it.
Yep.
So if you sell in year 2, they're not going to take back the first 2 years of the credit, but they could take back the remaining 3.
You just have to send them cash back.
Yeah.
It's a 3-year credit or a 5-year?
5 years.
Okay.
The state credit, it's not quite clear, but they're not going to take the money back.
Right.
I don't think you're supposed to or allowed to sell, but they're not going to take the money back.
Yeah. You're not supposed to or allowed to sell within 5 years.
Within 5 years.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Is it just a traditional bank loan that you get? I know you said that the bank you worked with also did the credit, but leaving out the credits, do you need a specific type of loan, or it's just any other, remodel loan?
Any loan. Most of our loans, and especially in the early days, like they didn't know what the tax credit was. They didn't care. It had no impact on their underwriting at all. They underwrote it the same as any sort of renovation project. And so then it's a typical loan, 30% equity, whatever, 4% interest, something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And banks don't give you like a cheaper interest rate or something because it's historic. They don't care.
They don't care at all.
They're private banks.
Yeah. They don't. Yeah. Doesn't matter.
They're banks.
They're banks. They're trying to make money.
What confidence do you have in the legislation to boost the credit to 30%, and has it played into your underwriting?
Actually, I saw that question. I haven't really seen the legislation. I know that at various points they've tried to weaken the program and they try to strengthen it. It doesn't come into our underwriting, I think, in any direction until like it becomes law.
Right.
Certainly if we had current buildings that were at risk of in the future not being able to get tax credits, like that would be something to consider.
Yeah.
But sort of anything else, I'm like, once it's a law, I'll consider it for future buildings. But until then.
And what's that person even asking? Is there something in legislation right now that the federal tax credit might go up to 30%?
Yeah, I think they're trying to increase the federal program.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why do state and federal percentages differ? Just that's how it is.
Yeah. Each state is up to their own. I think there are a few states that don't have a program at all, but most of the states do have it, and they just set up their legislation of how much of a credit.
Okay. Why do consultants stratify state and federal reimbursements amounts at different percentages, and why should one count more on state than fed when underwriting for total possible dollars reimbursed?
I think it's that question. It's just the difference of the law, 20% federal, and then state by state, in our case, 25%.
Okay. What are you most concerned about as the project sizes increase?
Yeah, I think it's really mainly, I think, cash and guaranteeing loans. You need a lot of cash, obviously, to buy these buildings and to renovate them. You need tons of working capital. I mean, it's construction. I guess, this isn't novel. It's even outside of the historic piece. You just have to float a lot of costs, and there's just a lot of cash. And so, it's like, how do you manage that as you double, triple, or whatever in size? So I think, that's a fear. And then just personally guaranteeing loans, not necessarily that I am worried about it. Like I believe in the projects, but there's only so much I can personally guarantee. And, do you have the network that can continue to personally guarantee loans at a much bigger scale? I worry about that too.
What's like the largest project you could possibly do in the district that you're currently operating in? Is there like old office buildings or things of that nature?
Yeah. So in Over the Rhine, the biggest building is probably 40 units, 50 maybe.
Okay.
But now we're getting more downtown.
Mm-hmm.
We have like a 26 unit building downtown, and we're looking at like a 75 unit building.
Yeah.
And so I think that'll be a really interesting scale to get into, where it's pretty much the same game, I think, but you're able to do like maybe 100 units at a time.
Yep.
And the biggest probably downtown is, they get pretty big, maybe like 300 units, but that's probably the biggest.
Are there a lot of people, and maybe not in Cincinnati, but just since you're familiar with the space, that like should be using them and don't because they don't know about them, or they think they're too hard, or like how often do you see projects that should have had a tax credit that people just didn't do because they just didn't know?
Yeah, I think it's probably happening a ton.
Yeah.
It's probably education, but it's probably more just like pain and like, oh man, I have another sort of regulation and get approved by this, hysterical board and all this stuff. And it's not a small benefit. That's the thing. It's like, it can be so massive where whatever brain trauma is involved, I think is worth it.
It's 45% of your project.
Yeah. And I think to what we were talking about earlier, it's like, if it's all there and you're preserving it, it's not that much of a leap, like you're saving costs. If you're using the original floor and refinishing it, like, well, that's easier than, like ripping it out and replacing. So I don't know. I think the perception of how difficult it is worse than it actually is.
Yeah. I mean, before this conversation, I fell in that camp. Like the thought of putting an application together for the federal government just seems like
to be reviewed by the like a state board and a federal board.
It's crazy. Okay, so how is what would, if you were to hire a consultant, and you're more than happy to share, you don't have to share what you guys charge for it. Like, what would it cost to hire a consultant to go through the process?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. Like, we haven't gone out to market much. Like, what are people pricing? I think our rough number is maybe like 5% of the project cost.
Okay.
Yeah, something like that for the tax credits.
And
maybe even a little less.
And if I didn't know you, and I was trying to do one in Fort Worth, who would do I Google historic tax credit consultants and that's what they do? Or are they just architects that also know how to do this?
Probably both. If you can find an architect that knows how to do it and is willing to, that's probably the best, because that's, the one-stop shop.
Yeah.
That, they might charge you for that, but that's the easiest.
Yeah.
But yeah, there are like historic consultants. They're probably in the same firm that would do like archaeological surveys or like research on a historic building, something like that. But yeah, that's probably just Google like tax credit consultant or historic consultant.
Yeah. I would imagine everything we've talked about is to the building itself. Is there anything you have to do as far as landscaping or outdoor that has to make criteria? You can just put grass down, some flowers, and call it a day.
Yeah. They don't care too much about landscaping. Yeah.
So from the time for your project specifically, how long are these renovations taking you?
So from the day we buy the building, hopefully it's done 18 months or less.
Okay.
There's probably 6 months of sort of this tax credit, pre-development, architectural permits, financing, all that. And then 12 months of construction. That's like would be a quite good execution, and even less. We're happy and okay if it's 24 months or less.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there anybody that like goes through the process, goes through the 6 months, gets their credit, and then like sells the project with the credits, but the renovation still needs to be done to the next buyer? Can you do that?
Yeah. Before you get occupancy, you can sell the building and transfer the credit. We've actually we've applied on behalf of other people and then bought the building and they transferred the credit to us.
Yep.
So you can definitely do it before occupancy. Everything gets very locked in once you have occupancy. Like that's a very hard deadline, including your ownership structure, who's going to buy all that stuff.
Yep.
So yeah, you can't sell it. You can't really change anything once you get occupancy.
And along the way, during that 12-month renovation, are you having to send updates to the state or the federal program along the way? It's just the typical city inspectors coming out and doing their inspections?
Yeah, there's no regular inspection along the way for the tax credits. And that can be problematic. I think are hyper-focused on it, and we've done a lot of it. And so fortunately, like I would say, know what we're doing. But if you get to the end and you had some consultant and you weren't quite clear what you promised, and then you're like, oh, what does it matter? Okay, I said 4-panel door, it's 6-panel. And I think you could reasonably think that's not a big deal. But if you get to the end, it's like, you don't get the credits. It's black, like zero, zero, full credits or zero. Like you said 4-panel doors, we have photos of that, and they're 6-panel, like you have to change them all out. So we've heard of that happening.
And again, your experience is in Cincinnati, but do you have any knowledge? Like if you were to come to Fort Worth, would it basically be the same process? Besides, you need to meet the people and get to know them. Was it the same kind of process everywhere you go?
Yeah, I think it's the same pretty much everywhere. I mean, each state program is a little different in terms of the percentages, if it's refundable. Distributable is another term, like you can allocate it however you want to the investors. That's not always the case. So that varies state by state, but I think the process is exactly the same. I know the federal application and that review process is entirely the same everywhere. And then the state is very similar. There's a state, historic board. I know Texas is actually very similar to Cincinnati's 25%.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think it's pretty much the same process everywhere.
And the day you get your CO, how long until the state wires you your money? Is that a week, a month?
Just you put it in your taxes. And so it's the same as like your normal tax refund. So it could be if you filed your taxes the next day and you got your refund a week later, it could be that fast.
But if you don't file, let's say you finished a project in like, I don't know, August or September of that year.
Yeah.
And you've already filed for the year before. Do you have to wait until the next filing?
Yeah, so there's some odd timing there.
Okay.
Hopefully we're queuing them up, or we have occupancy like November, December, sneaking in
Yeah.
maybe it's not even quite done, but we get occupancy. We're always trying to make sure that happens the calendar year.
Oh, it's a calendar year.
Yeah, calendar year, you get CO is when you can put on your taxes.
So if you get a project done in like January or February, you're going to wait about a year to get your credit.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And yeah, that probably varies state by state. Some will say when you submitted for the, part 3, or there's maybe some little wiggle room there. It probably just depends. But yeah, you have to pretty much when you finish the project, you get the credit in that tax year.
So is that a big part of y'all's strategy, is when projects finish?
Yeah, and we have to be really careful. Like once we're getting into, now like October, November, like, okay, what do we have? What do we need to do? And making sure we're clear on like, okay, is it when we submit it? Is when we get C of O, when we get like the T, temporary occupancy, what's the actual requirement and deadline? And let's like make sure we get that, because, to wait a year, that really hurts returns.
I don't know if you've experienced this, but if you, let's say you finished in January or February, but you were given the green light, you're obviously going to wait a year. Will banks like forward you cash, or can you pull on a line of credit to take that money and pay back investors?
Yeah, we haven't done it at the end of the project, but I would think they would. The state credit is a lot easier because it's refundable. And if you have a bank that understands it, they could kind of give you credit on that, at any point. So yeah, we haven't done that, but I think it probably would work.
In your market, do you have a lot of competition, or is it just kind of you and a few others? Or
there's a few. There's a couple, like less than 5, sort of much bigger than us, and then there's a lot that are much smaller than us. So there is competition, but I think that's sort of another benefit of this whole world and game is like, okay, tax credits, annoying government bureaucracy in Ohio. I have to do preservation. I have to sand floors. Like what what is this? It's like such an arcane version of real estate. And, it can be painful, but like that also means not a lot of people are doing it.
Right.
So there's definitely competition, but I imagine it's very different than, the world that we probably see online of like 20 bids and sight unseen and all this stuff. It's like,
so when people are telling you that, you're like, yeah, you probably shouldn't do it.
It's too painful.
Man.
Yeah.
Don't do it.
I should change my tune on all this. Like, too painful.
So I'm assuming you have a lot of runway to do lots of projects in your kind of neighborhood.
I think so. Yeah. And at any point that we either have, much more capital or run out of projects, it exists in almost every state.
Yep.
Including, there's I think the west side maybe of Dallas, there's a district and all downtown St. Louis and Louisville and Pittsburgh and wherever.
Yeah.
So, that would definitely be the aim.
Do you have a favorite historical building in the whole country? Maybe not one that you've done, but is there one that you love?
Yeah, a couple in Cincinnati. And if people probably aren't familiar, Cincinnati, like Music Hall, is one of the most incredible buildings on earth. It's where the opera plays and the symphony and everything. It's an incredible building, like 1876. There's also the Gwynn building downtown. People can look that up. It's great. I love Carnegie Hall is good, or like Grand Central, probably that people know.
Yep.
Fantastic buildings. Those are some of my favorites.
Cool. You are the co-founder of Cincinnati Preservation.
Yeah, Cincinnati Preservation Collective.
Okay, what's that?
So we started it in 2014.
Okay.
Kind of a bunch of young rabble-rousers, trying to prevent demolition and preserve historic buildings in Cincinnati. So the idea was kind of a young preservation group. There is like an older Cincinnati Preservation Association.
Yeah.
They've been around for a long time. So that was the idea. So we incorporated as a nonprofit. It's still active, but I haven't really been that involved for a couple of years.
Yeah. Okay. Is there anything like risks, maybe politically or governmental, that keep you up at night? Anything kind of going on right now that's on your radar?
Not really. I think you had a post that, the president kind of doesn't, it matters to certain things, but it kind of doesn't matter. In our world, it's, but yeah, so Trump tried to kind of diminish the federal tax program, but another good part of it is it kind of appeals on both sides. It's like, all the developers don't want it to go away and all the preservation people don't want it to go away.
Yeah.
And so there's kind of like consensus on both sides of like, hey, we should keep this.
Yeah.
And, I do think it's a legitimately good program. Obviously, we benefit from it, but, you have to finish the project. You have to invest a ton of private capital. You have to create jobs. You have to do preservation. So So I think it's pretty resilient, the program. So I don't really worry about like certainly any like federal politics as far as tax credits or our business.
On job creation, when you're putting like how many jobs it could create, are you just basically listing out all the vendors that will be working on that project? Because in theory, it might not actually create a new job. It just creates a job for somebody to go work on.
Yeah. So it's just like the number. So you say 8, full-time construction jobs. We expect them to make 120 grand a year. It's pretty unscientific.
Yeah.
And they're putting in some formula to see like, what that's going to result in. And they're also looking at permanent jobs. Mm-hmm. That's a big deal. Who's going to move there and who's going to work there and what that's going to mean for like sales tax and income tax and all that for the state.
Who usually owns these properties? Like, is it private owners that own these buildings that have just been vacant forever? Or is it usually now owned by like the city or the tax collector because they've just been abandoned forever? You usually buying from individuals.
It's both. So I think we're right now maybe 50-50 sort of public entity, which is the city or the land bank or like a private owner. And, the city's interest was in the 90s, they were going to tear this down. It's like, okay, we'll just land bank it and hopefully someday somebody will develop it. And now, the time has come.
Yeah.
So there was a decent amount of that. And then the private people is either like they tried to figure it out, did some renovation or bought it in 2006 for $2,000.
Yeah.
The one building we bought was a lady bought it in 2012 for like $15,000 and then sold to us for like $350,000, 10 years later.
Yeah.
So maybe those are the people making real money in real estate. Yeah. Just hold the building for 10 years and don't do anything. So it's a mix, but yeah.
On the city of the land bank stuff or what the city owns, are they usually posting that stuff for sale, or are you just calling them saying we're interested in this building, we see that you own it?
It's both. We'll reach out periodically, just like, hey, what do you have? Is there anything? And we have good contacts. The development office in the city is very good.
Yeah.
But then they also, I think maybe by law or statute or whatever, will publicly release any building available to be developed. They'll release like an RFP and say, hey, we have this, we bought a building, 8-unit building like this, where they release this public RFP. They say, anyone who wants to develop this, submit your proposal.
Yep.
And then they'll, sell it based on that.
And on vacant land, if you do a new development in a historic district, can you get a historic tax credit for brand new development?
No, the credit's only for renovation.
Existing structure.
Yeah.
When I think about not even these types, but I've had friends that have done remodels where you get a budget and then you actually get into the renovation. You realize you didn't think of these 15 things and structurally and et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything you've learned along the way where maybe early on, maybe you really missed a budget? Like when I think of what you're buying where you're just totally redoing it, does it almost function like a new construction budget since it is bare bones? Or are there things that you've learned along the way that you double check now that you maybe weren't obvious early on?
Yeah, I think definitely I think 2 parts to that. One is I learned early on that we're never going to scab on to like an existing system. We did a building that we were kind of partners in where, well, all the lights turn on. So how much could the electric be? It's like, well, the electrician shows up, all knob and tube. Once he gets into it, he's like, I'm not touching that. I have to replace everything, blah, blah, blah. I think people doing like lighter flips and stuff know way more in that world, probably how to save costs. For me, I'm just like, everything's going to be new.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to mess. I like, oh, can we save this cast iron pipe? Like, no, no way. So that I've learned of like, everything's new. We underwrite it. We budget as though everything's new. Brand new roof, brand new everything. And the only surprise would be on the positive side of like, actually, this roof is only, 7 years old when you get into it or whatever.
Yeah.
And we can save some cost. The other piece is, I forget.
Have you ever come across any like little treasures in these old things?
Yeah.
Just things that, when you, I don't know, ripped out a wall or pulled up the floor, you saw something from just way back when.
Yeah. A bunch actually.
Anything that comes to mind?
So I remember the previous point was, one thing we're especially looking for is like the code-based stuff. That will be the surprise where we go in and think, oh, this building doesn't need a sprinkler. It's only 4 stories. In our previous 4-story building, we didn't have to. Well, we're not architects. We don't know the code front and back. And once we get to the permit, it's like, actually, you do need a sprinkler. Okay, there's a surprise $50,000 cost.
Yep.
And so we've done much more on the front end of like engaging with architects, getting it as far along in permit as we can to know like what those sort of permit and building costs are going to be.
Got it.
But yeah, as far as treasures, so we always do a good job of like keeping the wallpaper. In almost every building we've done, I think over time, there's just like 8 layers of wallpaper, one went out of fashion, they put a new one up, and so on. And so we'll keep those, and they're like hand stenciled, balloons with a cat. There's like, these like scenes of an English countryside or whatever. And so we keep those, we frame them, and as much as we can, we'll then give them like to the investors. We found a teacup that was from Germany, and it's labeled on the bottom. We still have that. Found an old beer bottle. I heard a story of like a Mexican coin and floorboards in Cincinnati. So we're always kind of on the lookout. One, actually, I was like doing the demo of plaster, just ripping it down from the ceiling. And I just look and I just see like a beer bottle sitting straight ahead, sitting on top of the plaster.
Really?
Like, who knows, 100 years probably just sitting right there.
What are the biggest differences? And maybe there's really not many, but how people used to build things back then, maybe it's layout or, they had smaller kitchens back then. That wasn't as big of a deal. Like, as you look at modern day architecture versus, what you're dealing with, are there things that stand out that just show how people lived so differently back then?
Yeah, certainly much more confined, like much smaller spaces.
Yep.
Smaller kitchens. I think the kitchen, especially in this, most of these buildings weren't super wealthy people. The kitchen was very utilitarian. Like that's where you're, providing sustenance, and it's dirty and it's hot. And so like, that's a very small part of it where, now that's like the focus of
the house,
our homes. Yeah. So a lot smaller, I think just much more well built. I think, they were partially limited by the materials they had. They only just had like old growth trees. So they just had to use that.
Right.
They only had like brick, but it's just like such solid construction. I think they were probably just a lot more like true craftspeople. You can see it, when we're redeveloping. And so, yeah, I think things were, just built more solidly now. I think it's kind of much more mass produced now and a little more inexpensive materials, less long lasting. We'll replace the kitchen in 10 years. Like, who cares?
Yeah.
So I think that's more the sentiment now. But yeah, I think just much smaller. And one thing we find is in the early 1900s, they started to like mandate indoor plumbing and indoor airflow.
Yeah.
Which they didn't have before then. And so you see that kind of scabbed in where there's like this half level bathroom in a stairwell because all of a sudden 20 years into the building's life, they had to add a bathroom, instead of the, outhouse out back. So yeah, you see that too, kind of like transitions over time where this might've been like a 1930s thing. This was like an 1890s thing. And you can see like the lines and the, elements of the change over time.
That's awesome, man.
Yeah.
You get to live in a time capsule.
Yeah.
Well, we've covered a lot. Is there anything I didn't ask? Anything else that a rookie like me wouldn't have known to ask?
I think one, it's, what buildings can get the credits.
Yeah.
So typically it has to be 50 years or older.
Okay.
In a historic district or individually registered.
Okay. And when they're registered, who's registering them? The state? Or can an individual go say, I want this to be preserved?
An individual can nominate to register any building.
Okay.
Yeah. And
like, I could go take this office building right now and in theory, at least go apply to make it a historical deal.
Yeah. Yep. Any building in the country, I think 50 years older.
Okay. So I couldn't do this.
Yeah. You can nominate. And then, that gets into, it has to be, depending probably on the area, like approved by city council, and you have to write up this whole report and all this stuff. But yeah, we're looking at a building now. It's happened a few times in Cincinnati where it's a historic building. It's, 1910 or whatever, but it's just not in a historic district. And so they'll commit a year to get it registered to then get these tax credits.
Got it.
Yeah.
And so in that situation, you would say, as soon as that is registered, I would buy it.
Yeah, hopefully you could get it under contract for that period of time. It could take up to a year. So, we're looking at a project now where that's the case. And, how much risk do you take in sort of the designation process?
Yeah.
But we did a fair amount of legwork on that. And I think it's like 80% plus probability that you get the designation.
And on that 50-year thing where it must be 50 years old, obviously a building that's 49 years old this year will be 50 next year. Is there kind of this influx every year that, these historians and the state, as soon as they get to 50, they start trying to rush to get more properties approved?
Yeah, and it takes money and time to kind of designate an individual building, or even to expand a district or to create a district. Like, it's a lot of energy and time. So it doesn't happen like super frequently, and it takes somebody to drive that. And like the city or municipality is probably not going to do it.
Right.
So it's like local preservation groups or individuals that are creating new districts, expanding districts, and this is happening all the time. New York City and elsewhere. Like, how much can we expand? Which of course is maybe competing with, well, we don't want it to expand. I don't want my building to now be in this historic district, or I want to do a new development here. So they're kind of competing interests. So, but yeah, it means kind of a rolling thing where now, the mid-century modern, even those buildings are, now historic, and getting even later now into the probably 70s.
I haven't asked this, but can you get a building out of a historic designation, or is that just a nightmare?
I don't think you can, but even in our historic districts, demolitions happen. It goes in front of the board. There's a case to be made in Ohio or in Cincinnati that you have to prove like an economic hardship. And so you say like, this building does not make financial sense. I cannot upkeep it, and so I can demolish it. And that does happen. So I think it's all like litigated.
Yeah. All right, man, this has been fantastic. What is kind of the end goal? Just keep plowing away and doing more buildings, or is there a bigger vision? Or
yeah, I mean, I think the model applies. Certainly a lot more to do in Cincinnati, and then outside of it, I think it could be done most places in this country.
Yeah,
and that's always kind of been the ambition, to be like a very large, national developer, and then maybe at some point figure out what this looks like abroad.
Yeah. Is there any book or like a website or a blog where people can go read more on this kind of world?
Yeah, I haven't. There aren't a lot of good resources. We've written some on our site, the historic tax credit piece itself. The Ohio website, it's Ohio Development Services, the state tax credit. That resource is quite good. The National Park Service one is very bad. So it's probably not going to help much.
Surprise.
Yeah. And then, just the real estate books, outside of the tax credit world.
John, this has been awesome.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it. Yeah.
I really appreciate it. I learned a ton today.
Yeah. Well, I'm a big fan and, admire from afar. So I appreciate the time, and
vice versa. Thanks for coming to Fort Worth.
Thanks. Appreciate it.